welcome to my presentation on student advocacy. I always like to say that you should know your source, as in know where your information is coming from, and today I will be your source, and my name is Brianna Embry Banks. A very, very brief background about me. I am a graduate student at University of Maryland, Baltimore, where I am seeking a master's degree in diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership. I am also the CEO and founder of both Owning My Blackness and Owning My Blackness Consulting, where I serve as a mentor and a DEI consultant for my work in reducing systemic racism. Additionally, I am also a double regional award winner through McCuho, as I was named the 2021 Commitment to Social Justice Award winner, as well as the 2023 Best Presentation by a New Professional Award winner. That's some slight background about me. Just a quick abstract what we're going to get into today. We're going to be overall discussing the connections between critical pedagogy and student activism. We will also mention some historical background and current context that go into play with those. This theory of critical pedagogy and how it relates back, and also the recommendations that I have moving forward. The research question we will be addressing today is how can a toolkit be developed that effectively assists high school and college students in identifying and pursuing the most appropriate avenues of student advocacy? So let's dive in. So first, we're going to talk about that historical stamp piece that I mentioned to you before, starting with the court case Brown v. Board of Education. For those unfamiliar with it, it is a Supreme Court case, and I'll be taking you back with this case to 1953. This case was led by the NAACP, which had coincided about 5 different cases that were all challenging the constitutionality of racial segregation within the public school system. These cases came from various states, such as South Carolina, Virginia, Kansas, Delaware, and DC, all targeting this idea of separate but equal that we had seen in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. Now I'm just going to jump right into, so what is the forms of activism here? Like I said, this is all about student activism. So one of the key forms of activism was legal activism. Those who are unfamiliar with all the cases that come into play, it was more of the parents acting on behalf of their students. Some of their students were as young as elementary school, having to face this segregation and attempting to, fight back this idea of separate but equal. So this main form here that we see is legal activism. However, we do see great amount of another form of activism, which is known as protesting. Many students and their families, particularly within the southern states, had began organizing their own protest against this unjust vision they had seen in this idea of separate but equal. So you could see students across the nation participating in sit-ins and demonstrations in order to do their own protests towards this and support a Brown v. Board, and also to fight the idea that we've seen in Plessy v. Ferguson of separate but equal. We also see a slight bit of community activism, as they had all worked with the community organization, the NAACP. Okay. A next historical case we'll be talking about is the Little Rock Nine. So very, very brief background on Little Rock Nine. The Arkansas NAACP had handpicked 10 high school students to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Alabama. They were trying to see if the ruling on a previous landmark case would be enforced. Again, that previous landmark case, if you haven't guessed it, was Brown v. Board of Education. So they wanted to see if they would uphold this idea of now integrating school districts. So the NAACP had asked all of the students to walk in together on September 4th, 1967. However, one of the girls within the 10 never got that phone call because she didn't have a phone at home and did have to walk in alone. Another big issue faced was another one of the 10 students, her name was Jane Hill, had not only faced the angry mob outside of the school, for those who are familiar with Little Rock 9, but also the National Guard was called on these students. And in addition, Jane Hill's parents in particular, their jobs ended up being threatened. So the parents did end up pulling Jane Hill out of the protest and sending her back to her segregated school. This making the Little Rock 10 the Little Rock 9. The violence had eventually gotten so bad that President Dwight D. Eisenhower had sent 1,200 students and the National Guard to protect 9 students. Nearly a month after the first day of school, on September 25th, 1967, the Little Rock 9 were finally able to attend a full day of school. The types of activism we see here is both protest activism and political activism, as they were trying to see if, on the political end of it, that landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education, will be upheld. And the protest of it all, those 9 students continuing to act every single day, trying to get into the building, is a sign of protest. Another historical case we're going to look into is the Greensboro 4. In 1960, the Greensboro 4, you can see their names below, just skipping through it quickly. They had initiated a sit-in protest at a whites-only lunch encounter in Greensboro, North Carolina. After being denied service, they had returned every single day, progressively bringing more and more students from HBCUs. By the time they had reached February 5th, 1960, the protests had escalated to 309 students participating in the sit-in. The protest had eventually even gathered local media coverage and had inspired students across the country. By March of 1960, we had seen 55 cities and 13 states had organized their own sit-ins in support of the Greensboro 4. The forms of student activism we see here is protest, as you can see here with their sit-in, as well as social media activism. So by using social media as a widespread platform, they were able to get more movement for their cause. Next, we're going to move into the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were groups of students as well as civil rights activists that went on a series of bus rides beginning on May 4th, 1961, to challenge the segregation in interstate travel. Very soon after starting their traveling, they were faced with violence, notably in Alabama, where the KKK had bombed one of their buses and then attacked the riders. By the time they'd reached the fall of 1961, in hopes of protecting the riders with this high level of violence against them, the Kennedy administration had responded to this escalating violence by pressuring the interstate commerce to protect the Freedom Riders. This led to the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, enforcing the ban on segregation in interstate transit, making a significant step towards civil rights in the United States. So, the forms of activism that we see here is protesting, obviously, the students and the activists going on the bus from city to city, standing up for their rights. And then also, which wasn't mentioned, is how big of a role the media had played. Again, this idea of what we now know social media activism, back then just be considered media, had played a significant role by spreading their message nationwide. Their actions had actually sparked a widespread student solidarity where college students across the country had participated by supporting the riders and organizing their own local actions to show their support. Allowing a little bit more of some current day examples and context into this idea of student activism, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. Following the death of George Floyd and other high-profile killings of Black individuals, it had sparked a nationwide conversation on the topic of police brutality against the Black community and would broaden a conversation around DEI as a societal whole. The conversation had actually led to campuses protesting to broader community organizations and organizing efforts to social media movements, all in hopes of this idea of Black Lives Matter. So the forms of activism we see here is really highly within social media. As you can see in our screen, hashtags were heavily used here with hashtag BLM, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and as we see in the student end, hashtag Black at my university. This was a huge form, and again, spreading the message and showing solidarity. And we had even seen in the form of protests, students had organized on-campus protests at their universities in support of Black Lives Matter, most notably at the University of Minnesota and New York University. We'd even seen students working with many community organizations. One of the most notable mentioned before, the NAACP. Now moving into some of the theories that we're going to apply here. So this idea of critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy emphasizes the role of education in promoting social justice and empowering marginalized groups. It is a concept that was developed by a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire that emphasizes the role, like I said, of education in promoting social justice. Freire had advocated for a more interactive and dialogue approach to learning, where students are encouraged to question and challenge social inequalities, as well as encouraging critical thinking and taking transformative action. So when we think about this idea of critical pedagogy and combinations as it relates to student activism, this can be understood as a process that links this educational practice with a more social change. When students engage in activism, they are practicing this process of reflection and action that is really in the heart and soul of critical pedagogy. So next here, we're going to move into some legal proceedings and some bigger court cases that can kind of demonstrate this. One that's more notable in seeing student activism is Tinker v. Des Moines, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Independent Community School District. This was a landmark case in 1969 in which the Supreme Court had ruled that students do not shed their constitutional rights or freedoms of speech or expression when they go to school. This 1965 case had come into when Robert Kennedy had done a treaty, truce in Vietnam, essentially trying to end the war. An activist family called the Tinkers wanted to show their support in ending this war. And even their students or their children wanted to support also by wearing armbands to school. As you can see pictured here, those black armbands in the corner. You got to understand during this point in time, over this war, our nation was in shambles. There was protests and violence everywhere. So on the school end, when the students were talking about wearing these armbands in solidarity, the school did not want to cause a bunch of issues and had threatened to suspend the students if they would come wearing these armbands. The Tinker students, as long as their friends did not care and still came to school with the armbands, and they were suspended for it. The Tinker family did end up taking this to court, where it reached the entire way up to the Supreme Court, where they had upheld this idea of freedom of speech. The form of student activism noted here is this idea of protest, as we had seen with the armbands. Very, very quickly, another court case is the Bethel School District versus Frazier. This is a more interesting court case because when you look at it, the student activism isn't as obvious as a protest or social media hashtag. For those unfamiliar with the case, the court had essentially ruled that schools can limit student speech if it's seen as inappropriate or disruptive, even if the speech is a part of an activist effort. So essentially, there was a young student named Frazier who gave an inappropriate speech at school. This led to Frazier getting suspended, and Frazier had actually tried to fight that by filing a grievance through the school. And when he was shut down that way, he had then sued the school, and the case had taken it all the way up to the Supreme Court, in which he did end up losing that ruling. As you can see here, the Supreme Court did side with the school district here. However, when we talk about this idea of student activism, however you feel about the cause, this is a great example of legal activism in which the student themselves did continue to fight in this effort, sticking up for themselves. This idea of student expression, with Matthew Frazier, the student in question, really being the center of attention. This idea of him challenging authority and taking it to the legal efforts. Even with the grievance, this can be similar as a form of protest at a school board meeting and speaking up, vocalizing your points. Just he took it more that legal avenue with the filing grievances and then all the way up through the court cases. So next I'm going to get into my recommendations when we think about student activism. So some key points I would like to make here, if you are a student considering becoming in student activism, is I want you to consider these 4 questions. Well, 4 main points. Are you educated on your topic? Once you get into student activism, you need to make sure you deeply understand what you're talking about and the history behind it and what you're advocating for, so that you have a great understanding, a good foundation. Additionally, what change are you fighting for? Once you finally get the attention that you would like, what are you asking them to do? What is the outcome you are hoping to get? Knowing your target audience. Whose attention are you trying to grab? And is your efforts that you're going to do best shaped for getting that audience's attention? And finally, knowing your risk. Understanding that the potential consequences of your actions to make change could be very harsh. Are you challenging a law or policy? Could this involve law enforcement getting involved? Could you potentially be suspended or expelled if you're doing this in an educational setting, since we're talking about student activism? Are you putting your safety at risk? Thinking about some of the historical examples we'd given earlier. So again, really understanding your risk. Some methods of student activism. We had mentioned many here, but for the sake of time, I just limited down to just a few: sit-ins, marches, petitions, walkouts, rallies, and boycotts. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go super into depth in any of them, but please feel free to check out our toolkit that is attached in the paper below for more details. And also within the toolkit, not only, as you can see here, does it break down each of these methods of activism, but it also tells you the recommendations for what grade levels is best for, like if you're a high school student or an undergrad or a graduate student, which is the best way, and also when you're considering what you're advocating for, which is the best activism level to go towards. So please feel free to check that out, as we have already gone over time. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation on student activism. Thank you.